The amber glow of the street lamp filtered through the rain-streaked windows of O'Malley's pub, casting long shadows across the worn wooden tables. It was the kind of place where time seemed suspended between centuries, where the weight of countless conversations still lingered in the tobacco-stained air. Tonight, however, something extraordinary was about to unfold within these humble walls. John Locke sat alone at the corner table, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of ale. At 72, the English philosopher carried himself with the dignified bearing of a man who had spent a lifetime wrestling with the fundamental questions of human existence. His eyes, sharp despite his years, scanned the pages of a manuscript he had been revising, thoughts on the nature of government and the rights of man that would echo through centuries. The door creaked open, letting in a gust of cold London air and a figure that seemed to embody the industrial age itself. Karl Marx stepped inside, his dark coat dripping with rain, his piercing eyes surveying the room with the intensity of a man who saw society as a battlefield. At 45, the German philosopher moved with the restless energy of someone perpetually at war with the world around him. Their eyes met across the dimly lit room. Recognition flickered between them, not of personal acquaintance but of intellectual kinship. They were both exiles in their own way, thinkers whose ideas challenged the very foundations of society. Marx approached Locke's table with deliberate steps, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. "Mind if I join you?" Marx asked, his voice carrying a slight German accent despite his years in London. "It appears we both seek refuge from the storm." Locke gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please sit, though I suspect the storm you flee is quite different from mine." Marx settled into his seat, signaling the bartender for whiskey. "Perhaps. Though I wonder if all storms don't ultimately spring from the same source, the contradictions inherent in how men organize their societies." "An interesting perspective," Locke replied, his tone measured and thoughtful. "Though I would argue that the foundation of any just society must rest not on the contradictions you speak of, but on the recognition of certain fundamental truths about human nature itself." The bartender, a grizzled man who had heard countless debates in his establishment, brought Marx his drink and refilled Locke's mug without being asked. He recognized the signs. This was going to be one of those conversations that would stretch deep into the night. Marx took a sip of his whiskey, studying Locke with curious intensity. Fundamental truths about human nature. How convenient it must be to believe that the rights of property owners are written into the very fabric of existence. Locke's eyebrows raised slightly. "You mistake my meaning, sir. I speak not of the rights of any particular class, but of the natural rights inherent to all men, life, liberty, and the pursuit of property through their labor." "Natural rights," Marx repeated, a sardonic smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Tell me, Mr. Locke, when a child in the factories of Manchester works 16 hours a day for pennies, breathing in cotton fibers that will kill him before he reaches 20, which of his natural rights is being honored?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Locke set down his mug carefully, his expression growing serious. "That child's condition represents a corruption of natural law, not its fulfillment. When men enter into society, they do so to better protect their natural rights, not to surrender them." "Ah, but there lies the fundamental error in your reasoning." Marx leaned forward, his eyes blazing with intellectual fervor. "You speak of natural rights as if they exist independent of the social conditions that created them. But rights, my friend, are not gifts from God or nature. They are weapons forged in the crucible of class struggle." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on their faces, as the two philosophers began to circle each other intellectually, like gladiators in an arena of ideas. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside O'Malley's pub, the real storm was just beginning. Locke leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in contemplation. "You reduce all human experience to economics, Mr. Marx, but surely you cannot deny that there exists something in man's nature that precedes any social arrangement, a dignity, a worth that no king or parliament or factory owner can create or destroy. Dignity." Marx's laugh was harsh but not unkind. "What dignity does the worker possess when he must sell his very life force to survive? What worth can he claim when the fruits of his labor enrich others while he starves? These are not philosophical abstractions, Mr. Locke. They are the lived reality of millions." The conversation was attracting the attention of other patrons, though they tried to appear disinterested. There was something magnetic about watching two brilliant minds grapple with questions that had no easy answers, questions that touched the very core of what it meant to be human in an organized society. Locke took a long sip from his mug, gathering his thoughts like a general marshalling his forces. The warmth of the ale seemed to sharpen his focus, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decades spent contemplating the relationship between man and society. You speak of lived reality, Mr. Marx, and I do not dismiss the suffering you describe, but consider this. Why does that suffering strike us as wrong? Why do we feel outrage at the sight of a child laboring in conditions that would break a grown man? Is it not because we recognize instinctively that something fundamental is being violated? Marx set down his whiskey glass with deliberate care, his expression skeptical. What we recognize, Mr. Locke, is the contradiction between the promise of capitalism and its reality. The outrage you speak of is not the voice of nature crying out. It is the sound of class consciousness awakening. But surely consciousness itself requires some standard by which to judge. Locke pressed on, his voice gaining momentum. When we say that slavery is wrong or that theft is unjust, we appeal to something beyond mere social convention. We appeal to principles that we believe hold true regardless of what any particular society might decree. The old bartender, polishing glasses behind the bar, found himself slowing his work to listen. In his years serving drinks to philosophers, politicians, and common laborers alike, he had heard many arguments, but few with the intensity and sophistication of this exchange. Marx leaned forward, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Consider the very example you raise, slavery. For thousands of years, the most sophisticated societies on earth considered slavery not only acceptable, but natural. Aristotle himself argued that some men were born to be slaves. Were those societies simply blind to natural law, or were they expressing the natural law of their time? They were wrong, Locke replied without hesitation. Grievously, fundamentally wrong. The fact that error can persist for centuries does not make it truth. The earth was no less round when men believed it flat. But here you reveal the weakness in your position, Marx said, warming to his argument. You cannot point to these natural rights and say, there they are, as you might point to the roundness of the earth. Rights exist only within the context of human relationships, and human relationships are shaped by the material conditions of life. Locke's expression grew more animated, his philosopher's passion beginning to show. Then explain to me, sir, why the desire for freedom appears to be universal among men. Why does the slave yearn for liberty even when he has known nothing but bondage? Why does the peasant dream of owning land even when he has been taught from birth that such dreams are beyond his station? Because, Marx replied, his voice rising slightly, the material conditions of their lives create contradictions that demand resolution. The slave yearns for freedom not because freedom is written in his soul by God, but because his position as a slave creates material and psychological tensions that can only be resolved through struggle. A group of workers at a nearby table had stopped their own conversation entirely, drawn into the orbit of this philosophical duel. They sensed, perhaps unconsciously, that the questions being debated would ultimately determine the shape of their own lives and the lives of their children. You make man into nothing more than a product of his circumstances, Locke said, his tone growing sharper. But if that were true, how could change ever occur? If we are merely the sum of our material conditions, whence comes the vision of something better? How does the oppressed even conceive of freedom? Marx smiled, recognizing the challenge. Change occurs precisely because material conditions themselves change. The contradiction between the productive capacity of society and the relations of production creates the possibility, indeed the necessity, of transformation. Men do not dream of freedom in the abstract. They dream of specific freedoms from specific oppressions. And yet, Locke countered, you yourself write of human liberation as if it were an end worth pursuing in itself, not merely as a response to material circumstances. You speak of alienation, of the loss of human essence under capitalism. From whence comes this human essence, if not from something inherent in our nature? The question struck home, and Marx paused, his fingers drumming against the wooden table. Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming against the windows with increasing urgency, as if nature itself were demanding answers to these eternal questions. Perhaps, Marx said slowly, the difference between us is not as vast as it first appeared. You speak of natural rights, I speak of human potential, but we both recognize something in man that current social arrangements fail to honor. Indeed, Locke nodded thoughtfully, though I maintain that what you call human potential derives from natural rights that exist prior to any social arrangement, while you would argue that both potential and rights emerge from the material struggle itself. The conversation had reached a crucial juncture, a moment of mutual recognition despite their fundamental disagreement. The other patrons sensed it too, the way the intellectual atmosphere had shifted from confrontation towards something deeper and more nuanced. The fire in the hearth had burned lower, casting the two philosophers in deeper shadow as their conversation moved into increasingly complex territory. Marx signaled for another whiskey, while Locke contemplated the amber depths of his ale, both men sensing they were approaching the heart of their disagreement. "Let us speak plainly about property," Marx said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You argue that the right to property flows from natural law, that when a man mixes his labor with the earth, he creates a legitimate claim to ownership. But consider the worker who spends 12 hours shaping metal in a factory. By your logic, should he not own the finished goods? Should he not own the very machinery he operates?" Locke straightened in his chair, recognizing the tactical brilliance of the attack. "You misunderstand the nature of the social compact, Mr. Marx. Men enter into civil society precisely to better secure their property rights through mutual agreement. The worker agrees to labor in exchange for wages. This is a voluntary compact that serves both parties." "Voluntary?" Marx's laugh was bitter. "What choice does the worker have? He can sell his labor to this factory owner or that one, but he cannot choose not to sell it at all. He owns nothing but his capacity to work, and must sell that or starve. Where is the freedom in such a choice?" The workers at the nearby table exchanged glances, recognizing their own circumstances in Marx's words. One of them, a man with calloused hands and tired eyes, found himself leaning closer, though he tried to appear casual about his interest. Locke's expression grew more serious. "You describe a corruption of the system, not the system itself. In a just society, every man should have access to the means of improving his condition through his own effort. When that access is denied, when a small class monopolizes the resources that should be available to all, then indeed we have a violation of natural law." "But this is not corruption of the system," Marx insisted, his voice rising with passion. "This is the system operating exactly as it must. Property and the means of production necessarily creates a class that owns and a class that must sell its labor to survive. You cannot have capitalism without this fundamental division." "Then perhaps," Locke said carefully, "the solution lies not in abandoning property rights altogether, but in ensuring that they are more widely distributed. If every man could own land, could stake his claim to a portion of the earth's bounty, then your concerns about exploitation would be resolved." Marx shook his head vigorously. "You think like a man from an earlier age, when there were still frontiers to settle and empty lands to claim. But what happens when all the land is taken? What happens when the very process of competition concentrates ownership into fewer and fewer hands? Your individual property rights become the foundation for mass propertylessness." The bartender had given up all pretense of working, standing with his arms crossed, listening intently. This was the kind of conversation that happened perhaps once in a lifetime, and he sensed that history was being made in his humble establishment. "You paint a dire picture," Locke acknowledged, "but consider the alternative you propose. If private property is abolished, who then decides how the fruits of labor are distributed? Who determines what each man needs and what each man contributes? Do you not risk creating a tyranny far worse than any private monopoly?" "The people themselves," Marx replied immediately. "When the workers collectively own the means of production, they collectively decide how to organize their labor and distribute its products. This is not tyranny. This is the first true democracy in human history. And if the people disagree among themselves," Locke pressed, "if some wish to work harder than others, or desire different rewards for their efforts, if some develop new ideas or innovations that increase productivity, in your system, who decides the value of these contributions?" Marx paused, his fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. "These are fair questions, and I do not claim to have perfect answers. But consider this. In our current system, these decisions are made by a tiny minority who own capital, based solely on what serves their private interest. Surely collective decision-making, however imperfect, is more just than individual tyranny. But collective decision-making requires some mechanism for reaching decisions," Locke pointed out. "And any such mechanism must rest on principles about what constitutes legitimate authority. You cannot escape the need for some foundation of political right." "True," Marx conceded, "but that foundation need not be mystical, natural law. It can be the simple recognition that those who do the work should control the work. The legitimacy of democracy comes not from abstract rights, but from practical necessity, the need to organize collective life in a way that serves collective needs." A clock on the wall chimed the hour, its sound cutting through the intensity of their debate. Both men glanced toward it, surprised to realize how much time had passed. The other patrons had gradually moved closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of ideas that spoke to their deepest concerns about justice, freedom, and the organization of society. Perhaps, Locke said thoughtfully, we are both seeking the same end through different means. You wish to see the fruits of labor belong to those who labor. So do I. You wish to see tyranny abolished and genuine freedom established. So do I. Our disagreement lies in the foundation upon which such a society might rest. Yes, Marx nodded slowly. You would build on the rock of natural rights, while I would build on the sand of historical struggle, but perhaps neither foundation is as solid or as shifting as we imagine. The conversation had drawn a small crowd now, though the eavesdroppers tried to maintain the pretense of their own discussions. The intensity of the philosophical exchange had created an electric atmosphere in the pub, as if the very air crackled with the weight of ideas that could reshape civilization. Locke leaned forward, his eyes bright with the passion of engagement. Let us examine this question of foundation more carefully. You say that rights emerge from historical struggle, but struggle toward what end? If there is no standard of justice independent of power, then how do we distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate force? Marx took a measured sip of his whiskey, considering the challenge. Justice, as you call it, emerges from the resolution of contradictions. When the feudal serf struggles against his lord, he does not appeal to abstract natural law. He responds to the concrete conditions of his exploitation. The justice of his cause lies not in its conformity to eternal principles, but in its necessity for human development. But necessity according to whom? Locke pressed. The feudal lord would doubtless argue that the serf's submission is equally necessary for social order. Without some standard beyond mere assertion, you have nothing but competing claims to power. The worker, who had been listening from the nearby table, could no longer contain himself. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen," he said, his voice rough with years of hard labor, "but it seems to me that when my children go hungry, while the factory owner's children feast, I don't need a philosopher to tell me which one is right." Both Locke and Marx turned toward the man, and for a moment the theoretical became personal. Marx smiled approvingly. "Precisely, my friend. The worker knows injustice not through abstract reasoning, but through lived experience." But Locke shook his head gently. "With respect, sir, you do indeed appeal to a standard of justice. When you say it is wrong for children to hunger while others feast, you invoke a principle that transcends your particular circumstances. You believe, do you not, that all children have an equal claim to sustenance?" The worker frowned, sensing the philosophical trap, but unable to articulate his escape. "I believe my children deserve as much chance at life as any rich man's children." "And why do you believe that?" Locke asked kindly. "Not because Marx's books tell you so, surely, but because something in your heart recognizes their equal humanity, their equal worth in the eyes of their creator." Marx's expression darkened. "You invoke God to justify an earthly order that produces the very suffering you claim he opposes. If these children are equal in his eyes, why does he permit such inequality in his creation?" "Perhaps," Locke replied slowly, "because he has given men the capacity to choose justice or injustice, to honor or violate the natural law he has written in their hearts. The inequality you observe is not God's doing, but man's failure to organize society according to divine principles. Divine principles that somehow always seem to favor those who already possess wealth and power," Marx countered sharply. "How convenient that God's law should align so perfectly with the interests of the ruling class." The worker looked between them, sensing that his simple observation had opened a chasm of disagreement that ran to the very foundation of reality. He started to return to his table, but Locke gestured for him to remain. "Stay, please. Your voice brings us back to the human reality beneath our abstractions. Tell me, when you signed your contract with the factory owner, did you feel that you entered into it freely?" The man laughed bitterly. "Free. I was free to sign it or free to watch my family starve. Some choice that was." "Then the contract was unjust," Locke said firmly. "A legitimate compact requires that both parties enter it voluntarily, without coercion. If economic necessity forces a man to accept terms he would otherwise reject, then the compact violates natural law." Marx leaned back in his chair, studying Locke with new interest. "Now you begin to sound almost like a revolutionary, Mr. Locke. If most contracts under capitalism are coercive by nature, then most of the existing order lacks legitimacy." "Not revolutionary," Locke corrected, but reformist. The solution is to change the conditions that make such coercion possible, not to abandon the principle of legitimate contract altogether. And how would you propose to change those conditions? The worker asked, his interest genuinely piqued. What would make a contract between me and a factory owner truly free? Locke considered the question carefully. You would need alternatives. Perhaps ownership of land, where you could subsist independently. Perhaps access to tools and materials that would allow you to work for yourself. Perhaps membership in associations of workers who could bargain collectively with owners. All of which, Marx interjected, would require massive reorganization of property relations. You see, my friend, your natural law leads ultimately to the same conclusions as my historical materialism. The current system cannot be reformed, but must be transformed. The worker nodded slowly. Seems to me you both agree that things need changing. The question is whether we change them because God wants us to, or because we want to ourselves. Both philosophers paused, struck by the simple wisdom of the observation. In their complex theoretical formulations, they had perhaps lost sight of the practical unity that underlay their disagreement. Perhaps, Locke said thoughtfully, the source of our obligation to justice matters less than our agreement about what justice requires. Perhaps, Marx replied, though I still maintain that understanding the source helps us understand how to achieve the goal. The evening had deepened around them, and the pub had grown quieter as other patrons gradually departed for their homes. But the three men at the corner table, the two philosophers and the worker who had joined their conversation, seemed oblivious to the passage of time, caught up in questions that had no easy resolution. The worker, whose name was William, had ordered his own drink now and settled fully into the discussion. His presence had changed the dynamic, grounding the theoretical debate in lived experience and forcing both thinkers to confront the practical implications of their ideas. So if you both agree that things need changing, William said, how do you propose to go about it? Do we ask the factory owners nicely to share their profits? Do we petition Parliament to pass laws they'll never enforce? Marx's eyes flashed with revolutionary fervor. The ruling class will never voluntarily surrender their privileges. Throughout history, fundamental change has come only through struggle, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent, but always through the organized resistance of the oppressed. Violence breeds violence, Locke cautioned. When men take up arms against their government, they risk destroying the very principles they claim to defend. Better to work within existing institutions to expand liberty gradually than to tear down everything in pursuit of perfect justice. William snorted derisively. Gradual change? How many generations of children should starve while we wait for gradual change? How many workers should die in unsafe factories while Parliament debates whether to require safety measures? The question hung in the air like smoke, acrid and uncomfortable. Locke shifted in his seat, recognizing the moral force of the challenge. I do not minimize the urgency of suffering, but consider the alternative. Revolution often consumes its own children. Look at France, where the pursuit of perfect equality led to the terror, where heads rolled in the name of liberty. And yet, Marx countered, that same French Revolution swept away centuries of feudal oppression and established principles of equality that, however imperfectly realized, transformed the world. Sometimes the birth of a new order requires the destruction of the old. But at what cost? Locke pressed. And with what guarantee that the new order will be more just than what it replaces? Power seized through violence tends to perpetuate itself through violence. William looked between them, his weathered face thoughtful. Seems to me you're both right and both wrong. Some changes do come gradual-like. I've seen working conditions improve bit by bit over the years, mostly because workers organized and demanded better. But I've also seen how quickly those improvements disappear when times get hard and we don't have the strength to fight back. Marx nodded approvingly. Exactly. Reform without fundamental change in power relations is always temporary, always reversible. Only when workers control the means of production can they guarantee that their interests will be permanently secured. But control by whom? Locke asked. You speak of workers as if they were a unified body with common interests. But workers disagree among themselves about priorities, about strategies, about goals. Someone must make decisions, and whoever makes decisions wields power over others. The decisions would be made democratically, Marx replied, though with less certainty than before. Representatives elected by the workers subject to recall accountable to those they serve. And if the majority decides to oppress the minority? Locke pressed. If the skilled workers vote to receive higher wages than the unskilled, If the workers in one industry vote to monopolize resources at the expense of workers in another, your democracy without constitutional limits could become a tyranny of the majority. William laughed, but not with humor. Gentlemen, with respect, you're arguing about problems I'd love to have. Right now the few rule the many with no accountability at all. If we could get to the point where the many rule themselves, even imperfectly, that would be progress beyond imagining. The simple truth of the observation struck both philosophers. In their theoretical sophistication, they had perhaps lost sight of the distance between current reality and even imperfect justice. You are right, Locke admitted. My concerns about majority tyranny are real, but they pale beside the current tyranny of the minority. Perhaps the path forward lies in expanding democratic participation while building in protections for individual rights. And perhaps, Marx said slowly, the question is not whether to pursue reform or revolution, but how to build the kind of organization that can pursue both simultaneously, fighting for immediate improvements while working toward fundamental transformation. William raised his glass. Now you're talking sense. In my trade union, we negotiate for better wages today while we dream of owning the factory tomorrow. Both matters, seems to me. The two philosophers raised their own glasses, recognizing in this simple gesture a moment of convergence despite their philosophical differences. They had not resolved their disagreement about the foundation of rights, but they had perhaps found common ground in their commitment to expanding human freedom and dignity. To the workers, Marx proposed. To justice, Locke added. To getting the job done, William concluded, and they drank together in the warm glow of the fireplace, three men from different worlds, united in their hope for a better one. As the night deepened, the pub had emptied except for the three men whose conversation had become a journey into the deepest questions of human existence. The bartender had long since given up any pretense of closing, recognizing that he was witnessing something extraordinary, a dialogue that bridged centuries of thought and touched the very essence of what it meant to be human. William had proven to be more than just a working man with practical concerns. His questions had a way of cutting through philosophical complexity to reach fundamental truths, and both Locke and Marx had found themselves challenged by his straightforward wisdom. I've been thinking about something, William said, turning his glass slowly in his hands. You both talk about human dignity, about people deserving better than what they have now. But where does that dignity come from? Why should any of us matter at all in the grand scheme of things? The question struck to the heart of their debate in a way that surprised both philosophers. Marx set down his whiskey, his expression growing serious. Dignity comes from our capacity to create, to transform the world through our labor. What makes humans different from animals is that we can imagine something different from what exists and then make it real. But surely, Locke interjected, that capacity itself points to something transcendent. The ability to conceive of justice, to feel outrage at injustice, to sacrifice for principles that offer no material benefit. These suggest that human beings partake of something beyond the merely physical. William nodded thoughtfully. I see what you mean. When I look at my daughter, I don't love her because she's useful to me. I don't protect her because it serves my interests. There's something about her, about all people really, that just demands respect. Exactly, Locke said warmly. That intuition you describe, that sense of inherent worth, is what I mean by natural law. It exists prior to any social arrangement, any economic system, any political theory. Marx frowned, but his expression was thoughtful rather than dismissive. But consider this, that very capacity for love, for recognition of worth beyond utility, develops through our relationships with others. The isolated individual cannot love. He can barely even recognize his own humanity. Dignity is something we create together, through our social bonds. Perhaps we're both right, William suggested. Maybe dignity is like a seed. It's there in each person from the start, but it can only grow in the right conditions. Bad conditions can kill it, good conditions can help it flourish. The metaphor resonated with both philosophers, offering a bridge between their competing perspectives. Locke leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest. So you would say that natural rights exist as potential, but require proper social arrangements to be realized. And you would say, Marx added, looking at William, that social arrangements can either nurture or suppress something that's already there in human nature. William grinned. I'm saying maybe you don't have to choose between God and history. Maybe they work together somehow. The suggestion hung in the air between them, radical in its simplicity. Both philosophers had built their systems on the assumption that their approaches were fundamentally incompatible, but William's intervention suggested a possible synthesis. "Consider the implications," Locke said slowly. "If human dignity is both inherent and social, then we have both a foundation for criticizing unjust arrangements and a blueprint for creating better ones. And," Marx added, warming to the idea, "we have an explanation for why people struggle against oppression even when they've been taught to accept it. The dignity may be suppressed, but it cannot be completely destroyed. Like a plant growing through concrete," William observed. "The concrete may crack and crumble, but life finds a way." The bartender, who had been listening from across the room, finally approached their table. "Gentlemen, I hate to interrupt such a profound conversation, but I'm afraid I must close. However, I want you to know that in 30 years of tending bar, I've never heard anything quite like this." The three men looked around, surprised to realize they were alone in the pub. The fire had burned low, and the first hints of dawn were beginning to show through the windows. "Time passes strangely when minds meet," Locke observed. "Indeed," Marx agreed, "though I suspect our conversation is far from over." William stood and stretched, his joints creaking from hours of sitting. "For me, it's just beginning. You've given me a lot to think about, and more than that, you've shown me that thinking about these things matters." "It matters more than perhaps anything else," Locke said seriously. "For how we think about human nature determines how we organize society, and how we organize society determines the fate of millions." "Then we'd better think carefully," William replied, "and we'd better make sure that thinking leads to action." Marx smiled. "On that, my friend, we are all in complete agreement." The three men gathered their coats in the pre-dawn quiet of O'Malley's pub, but none seemed eager to end what had become a transformative encounter. The bartender waited patiently, understanding that some conversations cannot be hurried to a close. "Before we part," Locke said, "I find myself curious about something. We have debated the foundations of rights, the nature of dignity, the methods of change, but what would you both say to someone who asks simply, 'What should I do? How should I live in light of these ideas?'" William answered first, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience. "I'd say start where you are. Look around at the injustices in your own life, your own community. You don't need to solve all the world's problems at once, but you can join with others to solve the ones right in front of you." Marx nodded approvingly. "Yes, but remember that individual problems are connected to larger systems. When you organize to improve conditions in one factory, you're part of a larger struggle to transform the relationship between labor and capital everywhere." And Locke added, "Remember that the goal is not merely to redistribute power, but to create institutions that protect the dignity of all persons. Revolution without constitutional protection for minority rights risks replacing one tyranny with another." The bartender cleared his throat gently. "If I may, gentlemen, you all sound like you're saying the same thing in different words. Fight for justice, but remember that justice is bigger than any one fight." The observation brought smiles to all three faces. The working man's wisdom had once again cut through philosophical complexity to reveal essential truth. "Perhaps that is the real revelation of tonight," Marx said thoughtfully. "Not that we have resolved our theoretical differences, but that we have discovered how much those differences matter less than our shared commitment to human flourishing." "Though the differences do matter," Locke cautioned, "our understanding of foundations shapes our choice of methods, and our methods shape our results. A movement built on the belief that rights come from struggle will develop differently from one built on the belief that rights come from nature." William buttoned his coat, preparing to face the morning air. "Maybe the real question isn't where rights come from, but where they're going. What kind of world do we want to leave our children?" "A world where no child labors in a factory while others feast," Marx said immediately. "A world where every person can develop their talents and pursue their happiness," Locke added. "A world where people like us can sit in pubs and argue about justice without fear," William concluded, "and where everyone gets to participate in the argument." They walked together toward the door, three unlikely companions brought together by ideas that transcended their different backgrounds and experiences. The bartender held the door open for them, and they stepped out into the grey London dawn. The rain had stopped, and the air held the promise of clearing skies. As they prepared to part ways, each heading back to his own life and work, there was a sense that something had been accomplished, some truth discovered or clarified. "Will we see each other again?" William asked. "In every struggle for justice," Marx replied. "In every defense of human dignity," Locke added. "In every conversation where people try to figure out how to live together better, William concluded. They shook hands then, three men whose debate had illuminated not only their differences, but their deeper unity. As they walked away in different directions through the awakening streets of London, each carried with him the insights of the others, the questions that had no easy answers, and the conviction that asking those questions was itself a crucial act. The pub behind them stood quiet now, but the echoes of their conversation seemed to linger in the air. Questions about rights and dignity, about individual freedom and collective responsibility, about the foundations of justice and the methods of change. These were not questions that could be answered once and for all, but questions that each generation must ask anew, questions that demand not only thought, but action, not only conviction, but compassion. In the end, perhaps that was the most important discovery of their long night's debate, that the search for justice is not a destination, but a journey, not a theorem to be proven, but a commitment to be lived. Whether rights come from God or history, from nature or struggle, they exist fully only when human beings create the conditions in which all can flourish. That creation is the work of every generation, the challenge that calls forth the best in human nature, the task that gives meaning to the long conversation of civilization itself. As the sun rose over London, the city awakened to another day of struggle and hope, another chapter in humanity's endless effort to build a world worthy of human dignity. And somewhere in that awakening city, three men carried forward the questions and commitments that would shape their actions, and perhaps in small but significant ways, shape the world itself.